But I want to introduce myself. I'm Lisa Nuremberg. I'm the executive director here at Synagogue Arts Evergreen. And I am so excited that we have a full room today because I think that this series is so important. Before I go on to introduce our speaker, I wanted to say thank you to Mountain Metro Association of Realtors and bring up Marie Lynch, who's just going to talk a little bit about why this is important for them to support us.
So I'm Marie Lynch with Mountain Metro Association of Realtors. I'm going to share this here. We're a nonprofit trade organization, and we support our realtors and affiliates. And affiliates are lenders, inspectors, stagers, insurance agents, people who help support us as realtors. And we focus on education, and we also are involved in the community. We just did a food drive on Friday, collected 1,500 pounds of food for ECHO, and delivered that to them on Saturday morning. We do a fundraiser in the fall called Goldilocks and the Little Bear. It's for the libraries. It's open to the public, so watch for that. It's around Halloween, and it's a costume party, silent auction, etc. We also do Realtor Build Days with Habitat for Humanity. And just recently, we formed a diversity and inclusion committee, which I'm really excited about. I lifted up my chair, but we just formed a mission statement at our last meeting, and we're just getting started on what it is that who we are, what it is that we want to do. So we are very excited and thrilled to be sponsors of this speakers, and we're really excited for tonight too. So thank you very much.
Here. And if you guys were part of the first panelist, he was one of our celebrities that was part of our speaker series. So I'm glad he's here to support Luke tonight. You know, there's been this question kind of posed to us, and people said, what are the outcomes that you want from this speaker series? And I think that the biggest outcome that we want is a more compassionate community. But this whole process for us is we are learning just like you are. And we are doing a lot of listening because we believe that we live in a wonderful community. And if we can all be more inclusive and make people feel like they are a part of the community, then we'd all be making progress. And so I just want to say that we have had, like, the first speaker series that we had last 2 months ago, I guess, it was so wonderful. And we had this great group of speakers, and so many people said all of those people should be like motivational speakers because they were all so good. And actually it was Rabbi Jamie who introduced me to Luke and said, come on in. It was Rabbi Jamie who introduced me to Luke and said, you know, he is a wonderful advocate for the LGBTQ community. I think you'd be a wonderful speaker. And I think that we all have questions, right? What does LGBTQ stand for? Why are his, hers, they, them? Why are they important to recognize and to respect people's pronouns? He's going to teach us all of this tonight, and he's going to tell us his story. I am so excited to call Luke my friend now. Sarah and I got to meet him, and we're like reopened to be such good friends with Luke by the end of this. He's just, I love his passion for this, and I'm excited to hear what he has to say tonight. And you know, we want this to be a discussion. So Luke, of course, is going to talk, but we want it to be interactive. So if questions pop into your head, please raise your hand and ask, because we are all learning together. So without further ado, Luke Colaciello will be speaking. Sit over there and let me take the stage.
Maybe I'll sit down at some point. Well, yeah, thank you first of all, Lisa, for inviting me to have such a wonderful group of people here to be a part of this talk. So I'm relatively new to the Evergreen community. I really started to get to know the community 8 months ago when I started my job at Congregation Beth Evergreen, where I'm the executive director. And since that point, I've had so many opportunities to step into the community in different ways. And I'm really excited for this opportunity. First, to be in a space that houses such beautiful art and people's stories visually and verbally. It is really wonderful. Both my parents are artists, so I have a deep appreciation for this type of space and the centers of community that it can foster. So thank you for inviting me. Yeah, so I'm going to start first by just turning to the piece of paper that I handed out, because you have that in your hands, and I'm sure many of you have already read through it a little bit. So I just want to make sure that does not go unexplained. And so part of what I'm doing here today is going to be a little more personal. I'm going to be sharing some of my story, but in a larger context, Lisa and I first started talking because I do something called safe zone trainings. And safe zone trainings are trainings about how to be an ally for the LGBTQ community. And the trainings themselves are very specific. It's typically a 2-hour course, sometimes a little longer, but it goes through why we have these trainings. We talk about what's happening in our country. We talk about the language of queer people and the evolvingness and the constant learning. And then I present action items that you can take into your community to be allies. So that's what the Safe Zone training is. And we are hopefully going to set up some times that we're going to do that here, as well as Congregation Beth Evergreen, for the community to do those. So today's a little bit different. Today I'll be sharing a little more of my story and really opening up for conversation and questions from you all and engaging in that way. But if you want a little more formalized training, at some point, hopefully we're getting that on the calendar soon. So these group agreements are something that I start every training. And I think they are good to start a lot of different conversations with. Because what it allows us to do is, as a group, agree on what the expectation is of us in this space. And that is important because it sets it up early. And then we have a way of addressing any type of conversation that might be going outside the bounds of this, and addressing it using this as a guideline. So when I do the training, I do it very similar to this. So the first, be present. If you haven't turned off your cell phone, I invite you to do so now. But learning happens, as we know, when we're not distracted. We're really focused on what is at hand. Ask questions, please. Partly because I didn't like outline exactly all my talking points. So your questions are going to help me out today. But questions, curiosity, that's welcome in this space. And I know that sometimes language and how we use it, and not wanting to be, being careful about language is really important. In this space, it's okay to make some mistakes, and if you do say something that I'll correct you if it's something that I would say, maybe try this language if we're talking about someone who uses they, them, theirs pronouns. So that's an example. The Vegas rule, but slightly modified, so you might be familiar with what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What we in this type of space, the ask is that what we learn here, we want you to take out into the world. But what is said specifically, let's keep amongst this group. And so, if people in the audience or myself share personal information, that personal story stays here, but what we learn from it, we can take out. Laugh, it's okay to be uncomfortable. If you're an uncomfortable laugher, that's great. Hopefully I'll make you a little uncomfortable, and then we can all laugh a little. Give and take, so especially in a training situation where we're having conversations, in the training situation will be more like we group into tables so people can have conversations with one another. Making sure that your fellow peers are both heard and that you're doing listening. So just a little give and take in there, which is why, when I was conceiving of this, I'm very much used to having conversations. So like, okay, I'll take a little time for myself and stand up and talk, but I really do want to hear from you all at some point. Lean into the uncomfortable. right? Like I said, there might be concepts that you engage with today or in the future that make you uncomfortable. If I think about a set of skills to take away from the trainings or any of these types of talks that we have, one of those skills is, how do I sit with being uncomfortable, and am I okay with that? And I think learning to be okay with that is a really important thing. And there's conversations that I have had about my community that have made me wrestle with my own uncomfortability. So that's going to happen. And then reserve the right to change your mind. That last piece, we each came in here with an idea of a set of beliefs that we had or ideas that we held. It's okay to change those. And it's okay to change it during the course of this small time together. You have permission here. So if that happens, let's celebrate that. That's part of what this work is that CAE is doing, inviting us to change some of our mindsets. And then, as I would do in a training, are there any questions about these group agreements, or are there any other agreements that here as a group you would like to talk about, think about before I move forward? And I think when I think about this topic, the thing that I want people to take away is that this work is about honoring the experience of others. That is what I think my journey has, and the ways that I've engaged with diversity, equity, and inclusion. If I can think of the tools that come from that work, one of those tools is this ability to honor and witness someone else and their experience. And it's not always easy, right? Especially when we have polarized topics, we can apply that to anyone. I'm applying it very openly. Honoring the experience of the other. What's the other? So it can be any sort of thing. But so I hope that a little bit of what we can take away from today is that owning your own stories. I think while we're surrounded by this beautiful artwork where people have put their stories, their memories, their recollection onto the walls here. I want you all to be empowered to own your own story and to own your own identities. Because that's the third piece that I really like to think about, is that gender identity and sexual orientation aren't just things for queer people. Everyone has those. Whether you're straight or cisgender, you have gender identities, and you can own those, and you can play with them, and you can investigate those for yourselves. So I feel like that's already been too much talking from my end. So I do want to open it up, and based on what I've already said, if there are people who have questions, or if you came with questions in your heart that you like to share. I have a few that I know I can bring up, but I wanted to really guide what I say based on where you all are at. Yes, and if you want to say your name, so names are also a very important piece of LGBTQ allyship, especially when we have people who choose their own names and when those names aren't honored. So if you would share your name.
My name is Sue.
Sue, thank you very much.
So my question is it okay to ask someone to share, are you comfortable sharing with me your story? We have a family member who is in the process of transgender, and so it just came down over the Thanksgiving, Christmas holidays, and so anyway, I would love to know more about the story that kind of led up to the decision, but I imagine it's also pretty personal. I mean, but is it okay to ask?
Thank you for the question. So in case of people on Zoom, so to reiterate, is it okay to ask people about their story, maybe their coming out story, or how they came to understand their own identities? Most of the answers I'm going to give are it depends. It's based on context. One note about language. So you use the words transgendering. That is not the term. Your grandchild is
It's my nephew.
niece.
My nephew.
So they're transitioning to female. Great. So transitioning is the word.
Okay.
So they're making a transition from their old gender identity to the gender identity that they always held, that was always there, but society has restricted their way of expressing that. So first of all, just so powerful to see young people owning their identities. So I think that's something to be really proud of. When it comes to asking about someone's story, I think part of it is the groundwork there that they feel safe to share that in a space. Safety is a big concern for the LGBTQ community because our identities and our bodies can be violated through violence, through words, physical violence, verbal violence, mental violence. So making sure that they're recognizing if the space is a safe space for them, especially psychologically. It depends on what your relationship is to your to your niece, and to understand. But in general, I think if you ask someone, would you be open to sharing your story? Another great question is, can you tell me a little bit more about what your identity means to you? Is a great way of going about something, especially if someone has just come out to you. Because that a tendency, and this is one of the things we talk about in the trainings, is sometimes it's there can be that tendency to bring it to us, like, oh, I thought I knew, right? In that moment, it's advised to continue focusing on them, right? It's a really scary thing to transmit or to say those words, to speak those words out. Even if you know your family is loving and supporting, and it's still terrifying. So asking, what does it mean to you, is a really wonderful open question. I mean, we can use it for a lot of different things, right? People could probably ask that question more often in general. Yeah, so hopefully that helps frame it a little bit.
And I learned about the language.
Yeah.
And I'm sure to work more.
Yes. Yeah.
We get together about once a month, and we're older, 60s, 70s, one women's mid-80s. And the topic came up last week about one of the women has a nephew who has transitioned to female. And another one of the women has a doctorate in medical ethics. And the conversation sort of came to a point where the discussion was about, what about these younger, teens, older teens, young adults who make this transition, especially younger, with their parents' support to go through the surgeries? And is there a concern or consideration that they, take this with a grain of salt, that they could change their minds? And the finality of having the surgeries was a concern to these two women.
Yeah, so so the question is
Is there an age? I mean, one of the women said that her nephew, now niece, felt that he was a girl from the time he was 3 years old. And I think that the awareness at different ages and the commitment at different ages was a concern for some of these women.
yeah.
And it's an interesting thought.
Yeah, so again, so trying to understand what age would be appropriate for someone to transition. So there's a few things in there. So transitioning can mean a few different things when we're talking about the transgender experience. I would like to know that I'm not transgender, right? So I am very careful about speaking about other people's experiences. So what I'm going to try to do is convey the information that I know to the best of my ability. Transitioning can happen at different levels. One of those levels is socially transitioning, which just means you start using the pronouns that you identify with and start being recognized for the gender that you identify with. Or lack of gender, non-binary identities to assume a gender. So that's one form of transitioning, and that typically happens when people are younger. I'm not a medical professional, so I also can't answer directly to the medical pieces of it. But medical transitions can happen, I think, with parental consent later in teen years. So again, there's no surefire way. I know it's a conversation, definitely a debate that happens about when we should allow people to do that. And I will say, people try to bring up, there is a very small portion of people who detransition. So, but that is by no means a something to use to suggest that that's not a valid way for someone to move through society, as a transgender individual. Yeah, so it's a tough topic, and it's one of the pieces where I'll go back to trying to honor the experience of that individual. If young people they know themselves, right? And I think more and more young people have access to language that helps them explain their identities, right? I prefer the word queer from myself these days because my understanding of my own experience of sexual attraction is much different than it was at 13, and I've come into a community where people have offered me new language to describe my experience, and that's really empowering. So when I think about young people being able to explain what their experience of themselves is, I think that's so beautiful. And so honoring, if someone wants to start talking about medically transitioning, I think giving them a channel and space to do so is the best thing to do. When it comes down to making that decision, especially if they're younger than 18, that's a conversation and a decision that needs to be made by the individual and their guardian. Yeah.
So I would like to better understand what queer means. And Sarah and I have had this conversation because when we were young, queer was not a nice word, right? Mm-hmm. And it's been adopted to be a positive word. And so I would love some clarification.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so there's two pieces to that, right? Because there's also the acronym, as we mentioned, LGBTQ+, what is inside the plus, I can get to that. And so the term queer itself, we would consider what we call an umbrella term. It's both an umbrella term and a personal term, depending on who is using it. So as you noted, historically, especially I think in older generations, it was a slur, right? And there are people who carry it that gave them harm. And I think it's good to acknowledge that there were people harmed by that word. Don't use it. In a broader sense, the movement, the LGBTQ community has embraced the word queer, reclaiming our power. And so it's a word that can, like I said, it's an umbrella. It includes all of the acronyms, so the LGBTQIA, 2SP, it all goes under queer. And it can be a very specific identity. So when I say I'm queer, it's acknowledging that somewhere, somehow, I don't feel like I fit into the normative definition of what sexuality has been prescribed by society. I don't know if that helped. Do you need some clarification?
You just use new language.
Oh, which language?
So LGBTQ.
Oh, I expanded that.
Keep going and help me with that.
Yeah, so then the other piece of the other question that I get, why do we have to have a word for every single thing? Why do we have to have this acronym? And I'll tell you why. For me, the acronym, as I sort of started touching on, is a list of identities, a list of language that helps people describe their experience of the world. That's really powerful. When we have language, and there's limitations, right? There's never going to be a single word that is able to describe our experience. But when we have language that offers us the ability to better understand ourselves, that's really powerful. So We have LGBT, which is very, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. The Q is queer. Some people also say questioning, so people who are unsure of their identities. I added I, which is intersex. Intersex is a biological identity in a certain way. Intersex individuals are people who have different sets of chromosomes. Different. It can be a variety of different things, but it's based on biological sex, which again we're differentiating from gender identity. They are separate. Biological sex being assigned to us based on our genitalia, gender identity being something that we choose for ourselves based on how we align our image of ourselves with the sex that we were assigned. We go back to that. A stands for asexual or aromantic. IA 2S is two-spirit. Two-spirit is an identity that is held by indigenous peoples it's itself can be an umbrella term because indigenous understandings of what Westerners would call queerness is deeply rooted in their traditions, many of their traditions, first of all, and very specific on the tribes. So, but two-spirit is a term that is used to help indigenous people explain queerness, their identities. P, polyamorous, which is actually more of a modality of engaging with relationships. So, and there's more letters. I don't remember them all.
I'm really impressed.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. But so again, the piece that I hope to take away from that is that the reason we have the acronym, and it's a beautiful counterbalance to the word queer, I think, is that the acronym lets us, gives permission to people to find an identity that resonates with them. And the term queer is something that unifies our entire community. I'm cisgender, but because I feel so connected to what it means to be queer, I will always champion the voices of my transgender friends or transgender individuals. And my heart breaks when I see the horrible things that are conversations and politics that are happening at this time in our country. Yeah.
On the subject of language,
Yeah.
a couple of weeks ago, the humorist Fran Lebowitz was in Denver at the Paramount, and she fielded a question about non-binary pronouns.
Mm-hmm.
And she made the comment that she completely affirms non-binary people, but she doesn't affirm their use of these pronouns because they create problems for her and for me, because the singular doesn't really go in fluid conversation with a plural, with what is normally a plural pronoun.
Mm-hmm.
Last summer, we were with a young friend who is non-binary, and I tried to be careful and respectful, but I find myself stumbling, and it's an impairment to the free flow of conversation for me. Can you give us some suggestions about how to best handle what is an awkward, just verbal adaptation?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. What was your name?
Mark.
Mark and so yeah, language. So specifically, not everyone, but a lot of non-binary people might use they, them, theirs as their pronouns, right? So I think is that what you're referring to specifically?
Right.
And so how do we start? So it's a practice to start practicing shifting our usage of pronouns in that way. So there's a couple of pieces to that. So first of all, there are a lot of times in English when we use they in a singular way, we just do it so automatically that we don't trigger it. So I might say, oh, I made a friend. I might tell someone, I made a friend at the coffee shop. Oh, what do they do? Right? What does that person do? Because I didn't specify gender when I said friend. And so, well, what do they do, right? And in that quick sentence, we just use they as a singular pronoun. And I conjugated the verb following they as I would any time. So we still conjugate the verbs in the correct manner. So we actually haven't violated any usage of English language as far as I'm aware. So the practice of adapting your language to an individual, singular human that you knew, especially if you knew them using a different pronoun, it's hard. It takes work.
Can you give an example? Because I struggle a little bit with.
I can. Last summer, we were at a beach house and somebody said, where is, the young woman's name is Maddie. And there I just did it again because I referred to it as a woman. I don't know which, and the sentence was, they is in the house. That's the plural mixed with the singular, and it was, and then there were more of those kinds of things, but that's the, yeah.
The example you gave flowed, well, but that one feels awkward.
It
Sounds like
is.
a rap.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say they are in the house. Conjugate it that way.
So you said
so
they
you-
are. and
So that helps a lot.
That's what I heard. So we still follow the grammatical rules of they being plural, but we can apply it to individuals. We do apply it to individuals.
How do other languages do it?
Oh.
Say Spanish, where you conjugate things differently.
Well, I do. So languages are very interesting to me. So gender neutral language is something that is happening across languages, which is really, really amazing. Spanish actually, in Spanish, A-I-A-O-L, A-I-L, but you could put A-A would be, so instead of using O or A, you use E, which is the A sound, A-A or A-Ace.
So it's the neutral, they're choosing.
It's again, a lot of languages actually, sorry, this is a place where I nerd out. Language is being shaped by queer people because especially non-binary individuals are asking to be seen and reflected in our language. And so there's, you described Maddie as a young woman, but you could use a young person or a young individual, a young human. There's a lot of gender neutral language that we have available to us, and it's about practicing. And this is one of those things that we practice at the stage of trainings. Typically, I'll introduce maybe a stuffed animal. This is Jerry. Jerry uses they, them, theirs pronouns. Let's have a conversation about what Jerry likes to do. Jerry, they go on walks every morning, and Jerry has a fish of their own. And so you can start practicing these things. Rewire the brain. That's really what it looks like. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, as regards to use of pronouns. I belong to organizations that in all the Zoom meetings, they want us to put our name and our pronouns.
Yeah.
And for me, and tell me if I'm wrong.
Okay.
I feel like I refuse to use pronouns. My name is Elaine.
Thank you.
And I feel like using pronouns when you have a name, adding pronouns is just, I just get the sense that it's just another way of separating people instead of bringing them together. And one time, the facilitator insisted, Elaine, you have to put your pronouns in. I said, okay, so I put in we, us, because I felt like it was inclusive. And I have always felt that if I'm talking, I don't care who I'm talking to, whether it's male, female, queer, straight. To me personally, it doesn't matter. I see you as a human being having an experience, which may or may not is probably totally different from mine. But can I look at you as a human being having a human
experience differ from you?
Yeah.
Again. And so the more this whole pronoun thing comes up, you have to name your pronouns. I'm feeling uncomfortable because I feel like I'm being separated.
Yeah, so when and how to use pronouns, and really, so I can't necessarily, I hear what you're saying. So, and I want to offer where that comes from, like why people have been pushing to add pronouns, to provide a little bit of context. So do you, in general, though, just to clarify, do you prefer being referred to as she when people are talking to you, or something else? Like if I were to say, oh, Elaine, she's a great person.
Why do we have to use pronouns at all? Why can't I just say,
Cool. Elaine is a great person.
I met this guy Luke, or I met Luke, and I really enjoyed the talk.
Awesome. Well, that is even more progressive. And actually, I'll offer that. So I've had friends who don't use pronouns, and they ask that you just use their name. Okay. Yeah. So there are individuals who do ask that. That's why I kind of asked, because I wanted to make sure. So that is a piece of it. There are people who prefer, hey, can you just use my name? And there's some language things that come with that too. Rephrasing sentences so that instead of using a pronoun, you just use their name. For the push to use pronouns in virtual settings, I'll start with emails. So I am a big proponent of having your pronouns in your email signature. And I do that not because I want people to know my pronouns. I do like people to use the pronouns I identify with. That makes me feel good, right? It aligns with my identity. It's an affirmation that, yeah, people see me as the way I see myself. And I think that's the other piece of it is that it's about creating spaces where people who are trans, people who might use different pronouns, that they don't feel alienated. And I think that's for me the powerful piece of including pronouns in these really innocuous ways, right? Subtle ways at the bottom of my email signature. You know, I'm not explaining them to the world. It's just there. I mean, it's providing people the opportunity to say, oh, there are people who use different pronouns, and it's good for me to be familiar with those.
Oh, we're all gonna go change our email signature.
It's a great way to do that. Yeah. So Sarah, and then Rabbi Jamie.
Hi, Sarah. I will share, I use my pronouns at the bottom of my email, she, her, and I think she's on sort of 17. My 15-year-old who writes a book on gender identity and sexuality so well studied on this and wanting to know so much. But one of his friends came out to me and it identifies as a he, him, is a young man, but said, well, you emailed me and I saw your pronouns and it made me think that you were open to having a conversation about this. And so it was providing this nonverbal cue that I was a person who needed to be a safe space to talk about these things. And it had nothing to do with his pronouns, but it had more to do with the fact that he thought that I was engaged in the thought process of being willing to talk about sexuality or gender, which felt like a huge honor. And I didn't even realize how much that was meaningful to someone else to see that.
Yeah, I think it's like definitely more like playing on to. I've definitely like this opinion like does it single them out more, you know, but I think it offers a safe, and this is my opinion, offers a safe platform for those who want to come forward, and it offers a contribution to making that a safe place for people to start using that verbiage. But it doesn't force you to use it, it doesn't force others to use it with you, it's just there if somebody wants to use it, and it supports the concept of it. Which sounds like it's deeper than that. It is a concept, it's not, and that's understandable. I think like it's part of the question that I actually had playing on her original question was, how do you start a conversation about inquiring about someone's story, or you know, how do you know that doesn't single them out more to be uncomfortable
people, if they're different than everyone else, that we're like, I don't know where we want to really talk about it, like I want to know that they can talk about it, but I never want to really require it, because like, you're you and I'm me, and it's not really a discussion that I need to have.
Yeah.
But I also like, I understand when people want to open that safe space platform by inquiring about their story or what's going on. There's a fine line. Who
There
wants
is.
to talk about it and who doesn't?
Yeah.
It makes them feel even more.
Yeah. Well, so just a couple of points. Well, so Sarah, thank you for sharing that example. And it is one of the things, especially when we're on, when I was at the School of Mines, that we encourage professors to do, because along with, so essentially it's a signal for young queer people. That's a signal when they see pronouns in someone's email, they say, oh, they might be like accepting of me. It is a signal. Another thing is that we would tell professors, especially using gender neutral language to describe your partner. So, oh yeah, me and my partner rather than me and my husband or me and my wife. That's another like one of those little, oh, they use partner? Like, what does it mean? But it really does signal to people. And I want to acknowledge, Elaine, that I think whatever situation you were in, they did do something that I wouldn't do, which is then asking you and sort of making you put your pronouns. Usually in spaces, I try to, because of the point that you were bringing, if you want to offer your pronouns, you can. Because pronouns can also be, and this is where it can become complex, but pronouns can be a way of outing someone, right? So if someone is in a space and is not out, then all of a sudden and everyone's using their pronouns, maybe to offer the option of not sharing pronouns as totally okay as well, can mitigate some anxiety that might arise. So there are better ways of going about asking people to share their pronouns, but I think it comes from a place of people trying to create space that people feel safe in, and how I think of it. Rabbi Jamie?
Hi, Lane. Nice to meet you. And I also have sometimes a challenge because I want to be one to offer this prompt and be inclusive and put pronouns. And sometimes I'll feel like I want to identify as male, or I want to do I am or we are is my pronouns. And sometimes I think that. The way I think of it is the way I feel when somebody calls the place I work and worship a church. It's a pronoun for them. It's a house of worship. But I have to struggle every time I hear that to say, well, it's actually a synagogue. That's it. It's not a church. And to call it church actually diminishes my identity and makes me feel small and connects me to an oppressed history where church wants to consume the synagogue and become part of the church and take over. So, like a song, right? It's not a church. So that's where I come to, for my own emotional, find that place of what are the pronouns that are used that make me feel excluded? Because I think we all have, right? Labels that make us feel excluded. And pronouns just happen to be one where our review is becoming more sensitive to the fact that gender is fluid, which is why sometimes it's not easy for me to say he or in my pronouns. And I want to reflect also on the conversation earlier about when we ask about a person's story, how do we create an opening without putting someone on the spot? And one of the tools I use is to ask if my desire to know their story is driven by my curiosity or my desire to honor them. And often my curiosity is driven by my own discomfort and fear around gender fluidity or some other difference, transgender identity. And if I can identify that, I can answer my own question.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful point. Went to a way of self-monitoring, right? When you have those types of questions, it's I think partly built into the larger conversations that are being had. You know, it's easy to say, to go, you know, oh, can you, like, what kind of guys are you interested in? Or like to, you know, those types of things that, yeah, so questions that are invasive. They happen a lot. So you want having a filter like what Rabbi James shows. Yeah.
Yeah, and that opening step. You want to be sensitive to who they are as what they identify with, obviously. And you want to, you know, have this, I guess, sense of mental protocol that you want to kind of open up a dialogue with them without not only you feeling awkward and blah, 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 like a, you know, some sort of trauma that you're trying to get through to try to make yourself understand transition, restore who they are and to identify as a person. I feel like if I was trying to do that in a way that was automatically coming off as awkward, and they're not going to open up because they're like, oh God, what's going on with this guy? He's feeling awkward. To me, how do you get that bridge where they feel comfortable, not necessarily just knowing them as a person, but just opening up conversations where, you know, you in the back of my mind, like, oh, I don't want to misstep and be awkward with them, and then they're going to feel awkward.
Yeah.
You know, how do you do those bridges of conversation as it was pivots that Rabbi James kind of changed things?
Yeah, and it's a hard thing to answer.
Yeah, yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, so I think that a few of those pieces are, I mean, a few, right? I think it's wonderful when we genuinely want to get to know another person, right?
Right.
So I think part of it is,
I want to see it like natural instead of just like, you know, oh, geez, did I do something wrong? And did I, you know, call you the wrong pronoun?
Yeah.
You know, those type of things. You know, you're dancing on eggs when you just want to know this person.
Totally. So that fear is super valid, right?
Yeah.
I've been in that position, right? And fear of making a mistake, fear of hurting a friend or a potential friend, you know, and those are, it's going to happen. I've misgendered friends before. What we would talk about in training is if that happens, usually if it's in a group setting, you don't want to call attention to it. You know, it happens, let it go, but maybe later when you're one-on-one with this individual, say, hey, man, I messed up, and you know, usually I don't use words like man, you know, but like, I messed up. I'm very good about my gender neutral language. I messed up, sorry about that. And you know, people know that it's a transition for a lot of, not just for the person, but the people around them as well. So that's one. And then practicing, right? I think, especially when it comes to pronouns and language, there are ways to practice. Again, I can give you that example. You know, choose an inanimate object in your house. Maybe they use they them pronouns or use a dog. Right? Just practice using that language. I mean, it helps. And I think, you know, coming from a place, so I think the other piece is not reducing someone down just to one identity. So, which wasn't what I was, but it came to me when you were speaking, right? It's really important that we recognize that we are full humans and we all have many identities. And that's part of what I like to say during these kind of talks or during the training is that each one of us has access to our own identities. When we're a part of a majority identity, so for example, cisgender. Does everyone know what I mean when I say cisgender? Okay, so great. So, and it's likely an identity you hold. So we're familiar with the term transgender. Transgender refers to any individual at an umbrella level, any individual who the sex that they were assigned at birth based on their genitalia does not align with their gender identity, how they see themselves. That's a transgender individual at the broadest level. So a cisgender individual is someone who the sex that they were assigned at birth matches the gender that they see themselves as. I am cisgender, I was assigned male at birth, and I identify as a male. So I'm cisgender. So if that's true for you, then you also have a gender identity, and it's cisgender. So I like to use that as an example because it also breaks down barriers of otherness, right? It's super easy to say, oh, transgender people, right? They have gender identity, they're something else. No, we all have a gender identity. And so when we start owning that identity, first of all, I think it's really empowering for us as individuals to be like, oh, I have this piece of my identity that I have ownership of, and that I'm not just going along with, the majority in terms of a societal level of understanding of gender. So we can start owning those things.
Were you saying cisgender, S-I-S gender?
It's, yes, C-I-S. Yeah. So cis means same. Yes. So in terms of, this is my chemistry background as well, so anyway, but yes, the trans obviously means opposite or translating. So cis is the opposite of trans. Yeah.
Just want to kind of dovetail my
Oh, pardon.
So discussions in over here where don't beat yourself up too bad. You're trying. And I have great success with transgender individuals when I would say, I'm here, I'm supportive. I may not get everything right, but I'm willing to make it learn. Be respectful. But I also think, and I'm also part of I get on a fairly regular basis, what does your husband do? Why? So I don't get all bent out of shape. Nobody's saying that to me in malicious. So I just have kindness and we just go on about it. So I think those of us in LGBTQ, we also have nothing wrong with us educating and having that exchange in a kind, respectful way. So I think we have a duty to help as well. It's not about being like better get it right 150%. It's not about that. So go easy on yourself. And we're all trying. We're all experts. I'm not. So I don't know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I like to say that, I'm only an expert really in my own experience. But thank you for sharing that because I think it is generally, people queer people understand that, oh yeah, this is evolving for other communities and language, even within our own community, language is changing rapidly. And so there's always about some learning.
And like say someone say like, oh, she started today, and just like don't dwell on things, or be like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I totally messed that up. If bringing it up, then it's but like if you just move on with it, and like eventually, I know from experience, a lot of friends have changed their pronouns, and so like after she has to mess it up, but like I'm used to it, but it just takes time.
Yeah, thank you. It does take time. So I think, and that is both, being honoring ourselves as well as honoring other people.
I think like to kind of add on to that, I've had a conversation. My mom's a Christian minister, and again, that was not really direct correlation, but there's struggles with the traditional way that she wants to understand. And I'm obviously have questions about, in this way, but it's unfortunate that they have to have the part of educating and education. That's like another part of like the way that it's fair. But the way that I think about it is how difficult it is for me to get the pronouns and how frustrating it becomes. And goes to this mindset or I get into this like really negative mindset. always which kind of brings me back down to understanding that. And also, like I said, unfortunately, the way that they have to carry this whole process is added because they also are public understanding the process. We all want it together.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing such an honest. Yeah, I think we've all felt those types of things or get frustrated because there's so much new information
and like there was a time where it wasn't okay to even come out. You come on by because you opened the door for that. For people to keep. And so the contribution of that is important. Welcoming people. Still not.
Yeah. Yes, I know it's almost 7, so maybe I'll offer some closing thoughts. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you all for being here and showing your. So what I called this was doing the work to be there for others. Was kind of the title that I proposed, and I want to be clear about the work is many different things. There's a lot of ways to be an ally. What I wanted to get across here is that for me, I think the most important work is the work that we do for ourselves in dismantling systems and ideas that have been ingrained in us without us even knowing. So you brought up the history of LGBTQ oppression, essentially. It wasn't until the 80s, I think, maybe 70s or 80s, that being gay or lesbian was taken out of the diagnostic statistical manual. The thing, you could go to a mental hospital for being gay. That was in the 60s, in the 70s. That's not so far from where we are right now. And so to have that frame, to kind of hold that in your heart and mind is a little bit of a reminder that, yeah, we have marriage equality in our country, right? That was beautiful, that was amazing. And there's so many other things that our country is still attacking and oppressing queer people about. I mean, we see it right now. There's more than 200 bills in state senates, in state houses, trying to prevent transgender individuals from playing sports, or laws being passed in Texas which can criminalize parents from giving their children gender-affirming care. Those are tools of oppression, right? And so it's still happening, and that's why part of this work I do the Safe Zone trainings because that's still part of what our society and us individually are working on moving through. So yeah. Yeah.
So when somebody says to me their personal pronoun is they, I'm really not clear what their pronoun is. There just one thing we're talking about, is it diverse?
Well, in that statement, I would take the statement as it is, and what I would extrapolate from it, I wouldn't necessarily assume what their gender identity is. So people can identify as, I can identify as a male, as a man, and use they, them, theirs pronouns. That happens, right? So I wouldn't assume gender, but what I would take from that is that they're offering you a way to describe them when you're talking about them in the third person. Right, so if I say my name is Luke and I use he, him, his pronouns, later you can go off and say, oh, Luke, he gave this talk at the Center for the Arts, right? So you know very definitively what my pronouns are to describe me in that situation. So if I said my name is Luke and my pronouns are they, them, theirs, later you can say, oh, Luke, they gave a wonderful talk at hopefully a wonderful talk at CA, right? So that's what I would take from it, just a way to describe that person when you're talking about them. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, well, thank you all again. Thank you, Lisa, and I'm more than happy to hang out a little bit, talk a little more about questions.
And I want to say thank you to Luke. I mean, you went to a very vulnerable place, and so I am incredibly grateful for that. And I'm grateful that there are so many of you here, because if we look at where we were and the fact that we are all having this conversation and we are asking questions, I mean, that is big steps in making strides to be more compassionate. I think the more that we learn and the more we listen, the more we understand and we connect, that we are all just humans. And it really doesn't matter what somebody's sexual preference is. It doesn't affect us at all, except for, is that person happy? And so I just really want to say thank you so much. And I really would love, we're going to offer some safe zone training here. And I know that Beth Evergreen is going to offer some. So, you know, we'll have this sent out to people who are interested in that. But, you know, I do, one thing that I did love about this whole thing is that I'm a naturally curious person. And I ask a lot of questions, but I do think you have to make sure that that person is comfortable with that.
Well, that reminds me of one of the other points that I wanted to say, but really forgot, so thank you. You know, just in terms of using, so we might know a gay person or we might know a trans person. I do want to caution people of using that individual in our lives as your source of information, because it can get tiring after a while if you're just going to them. And so and this is part of the trainings as well, what we say is, we have the internet now, right? So first go to the internet, go to Google and ask the question to Google and see what information comes up. And see if you can answer that question based on the many resources that we already have available. And then if you still have questions about your friend that are a little more tailored to their experience, maybe you can open that conversation. Just a reminder, I had to remind my chemistry students all the time that they have Google to ask questions to. It's crazy. So,
and you know, no, but and I wanted to end with this, that a big reason why we decided to do this was through our teen show. If any of you guys came to that teen show, I mean, so many of these kids used art to tell their story. They talked about coming out during COVID, and I mean, for us, we just felt like this is so amazing that these kids feel like they have a vehicle to express themselves. But what it really did is I see a lot of all of us who are older, and I'm so happy that we're open to these conversations, because we need to let our young children know that we love them. I mean, we're leaving the world to them. And so I just think that it's so wonderful that we're all open to these conversations, because the more we have a conversation, the more we understand our youth and embrace who they are. And if we can embrace who they are, then they're going to grow up to be stronger, better people. So thank you, thank you.